Hey everyone, this time around I wanted to try a different kind of video. This is mostly a prediction of characters that might become playable based on their relevance to the story, but also an opportunity to briefly talk about them. Take into account that there are many other factors that will affect characters becoming playable, especially their overall popularity, but still. Also, most NPCs that will eventually become playable are usually featured in side chapters, which often don't have a very specific time frame, so it's easier to just release them whenever Kuro feels like it, despite their current relevance to the story. The only exception to this is Teddy, which is the only A-rank character released with a main story chapter outside of a few others very early on. Also, some characters like Bridget remained in NPC jail for a very long time despite their popularity, while Akma became playable with the very next patch, so there is a lot of variance in that aspect. Some characters are also affected by the male debuff, which reduces the chances of becoming playable by about 80%. The good news is that they also have less competition between each other, since in the PGR world, if you're not an old politician, you're most likely a hot woman. But anyway, let's start. Arcana is the mother of the Church of Machina, and also one of the founders, which guided and recruited the new members during Nanami's absence. She is a very important character, even if she wasn't part of any major event. We don't know much about her backstory, but considering her role, I believe she will remain a background character for the time being, despite having the potential to become playable in the future. Cervantes is the tower of the Church of Machina. He has quite a few appearances in the story, but is more of an artist than a fighter, and considering that we have already seen a lot of his backstory, it might not be a priority for becoming a playable character, especially considering the competition within the church. Dulcinea is another member of the Church of Machina. She shares similar interests with Cervantes, and she worked with him in Constellia. Overall, she's not as important as Cervantes, and considering their similarities, I would be very surprised if she became playable before him, even if in her case we don't know much about her background. Schultz is the Emperor of the Church of Machina. Originally a simple program developed during the Golden Age, Schultz had acquired self-awareness when they had attempted to delete it, which caused him to develop an intense hatred toward humanity. He is the main Mechanoid enemy, in direct opposition with Nanami despite being both part of the Church of Machina. Schultz doesn't have an actual body since he hacks into other machines, and considering that his goal is to eliminate human and shape a world dominated by machines, I don't believe we are ever getting a playable Schultz. Well, unless he hacks into a cute mechanical girl. Spooner is the death of the Church of Machina. Besides a few appearances with other members of the church, he didn't do anything too significant so far, but is definitely an important character that could be expanded upon. That said, being a male mechanical furry might hold him back as a playable character, since that's a very polarizing design. I would have still said that he had decent chances of becoming playable, but after Veronica stole his background, maybe less so, or at least not anytime soon. Trailblazer is the chariot of the Church of Machina. They used to be a machine built for peacekeeping during the Golden Age, and they later attempted a frontal assault against Babylonia together with Akma, which would have been devastating if they hadn't been stopped by Nanami. Despite not having a playable Trailblazer should be considered a crime, it's probably harder to sell a fully mechanical character, but maybe if they put a waifu inside of them... I should put Trailblazer as unlikely, but I want to believe, so I'll say maybe. Xavier is the magician of the Church of Machina. He's a fairly important member of the church, but is more like a technician that takes care of the other mechanics, like the Asimov of the machines, and not really a fighter. That doesn't necessarily prevent him from becoming a playable character, but together with his very unique design, I feel like other characters might have priority. Zero is the lover of the Church of Machina. She is obsessed with Nanami, but the fact that she doesn't truly understand Nanami's intentions can make her fairly dangerous and easily deceived. Personality-wise, I believe she has a lot of potential, and considering that she is part of an important faction, I think she's a strong candidate to become the next playable member of the church. The Star is a kid mechanoid of the Church of Machina, most likely made by Hierophant, which is still an unseen founding member of the church. We don't really know much about the Star, and we have seen her briefly only in the 30 years of timeskip of the previous timeline. She doesn't have any lore relevance so far, but she's still part of an important faction, and maybe she could be the first playable mechanoid kid, if we ever need to fill that role. Overall, I will say unlikely at the moment, but who knows. Amina is another member of the church, but we don't know much about her so far. In the main story, we only know that she helped Xavier fix the Great Tower after it had been disrupted by Schultz's code, and we have seen her for the first time only in a side event. Being a member of the church, she definitely has some potential. She could also be Hierophant, since we don't know her church title, but we don't have any information about that. Ewig is one of the few mechanoids not affiliated with the Church of Machina. She's one of the android girls of the Gastroid Academy, created through consciousness sampling by the Leibowitz researchers at the Matrix facility. Despite having a very different personality, her concept and background is very similar to Jetovi. This by itself can be a big limitation in making Ewig a playable character, but they can still structure an interesting backstory focusing on the research and sample the consciousness like they did with Yui. Also, it's very likely that the Leibowitz company and their Matrix facilities will end up being more relevant in the main story later on, giving Ewig a chance to become playable. So, her similarity with Jetovi is a big downside, but she still has story potential, and I believe we will see her again regardless. Formerly known as Lloyd, Ephialtes chose this name after becoming an Ascendant and changing his view on humanity. He was defeated by Vera at the Gene Bank facility, but he managed to escape thanks to his ability to transfer his consciousness into other machines. He is definitely an important enemy, but if Lilith became playable despite having never met us in the story, I don't see why Ephialtes can't. Lithos is an Ascendant and one of the most important characters of the story. His actions caused us so many issues that the entire story will be drastically different without him. He sacrificed countless people for his experiments on the Red Tide, believing that it was the only way to save humans from the punishing virus. You could even argue that he's not a bad person, just extremely psychotic, and is simply trying to help people in the worst way possible. Lithos has a lot of lore potential, especially considering his connection to many important characters, and together with Paper Crane, he could have an interesting design for a playable character. Maybe a bit of copy, because I wouldn't mind knowing more about his backstory, but lore-wise it would be a great candidate for a playable character, especially considering that he should be part of Luna's Ascendants now. Isel is a former member of Ygritte, a Babylonia task force teams, but he abandoned them since he hated Vanessa, which is very understandable considering that she used to strap bombs on her constructs and use them as bait whenever she felt like it. There is a lot of story potential between the two, and we will definitely see him again in the future, but him becoming playable is just a maybe, especially with the new Ygritte members that might get priority. He also joined Luna's Ascendants together with Lithos, so that can also be a good opportunity for some development in his story. Vonnegut is an agent of the Ascension Network, and one of the main villains of the story that basically caused most of our issues. I believe that everyone expects him to become playable eventually, and it's just a matter of when. Considering the recent events of the new timeline, it seems like this moment has been pushed further away. If we have to wait until the appearance of the tower, it might be a very long time, but who knows, the main story is fairly open at the moment and anything can happen. That said, I think we'll have to wait at least a year. Voodoo used to be an abandoned child of Ashlar, and she was used by Lithos for his experiments on Project Tila. Voodoo's personality had been merged with Loki, a deranged test subject used for Project Tila, with the only goal of stabilizing Loki's mind. However, the two had been separated again, and eventually Loki had been killed by Lamia. We don't know much else about Voodoo, but she also joined Luna's Ascendants together with Lithos, so we might see more of her in the future. Also, she looks cool. Isarius is one of the most prominent members of the Purifying Force. He appeared in the story quite a few times now, and considering that Bianca is still the only playable member of the Purifying Force, I believe that he is a very strong candidate. We also don't know anything about his background, so he can easily get his own story. Leia used to be a construct stationed in a conservation area, and she recently became a member of Ygritte, Vanessa's team. Despite being fairly new, we have seen her quite often recently, and since she is part of an important Babylonia task force team, she is definitely a strong candidate, especially since we don't really know much about her backstory. Leonie is a member of the War Government Association of Art that appear quite often in many side stories related to the use of simulation devices, but so far she's been mostly a background character for the main story. I was expecting a full WGAA team with her, Isla and Selena in the new timeline, but I guess the events of Constellia were mostly unchanged, so that didn't happen. That said, there is still chance for her to become playable, and she can still be used to expand Isla and Selena's sides of the story. Lillian is a member of Dark Ares, together with Noan and Palma. She's not one of the most prominent characters, but she's still a member of an important team, so I think there is a chance of her becoming playable eventually. Even if we haven't seen much of her specifically, we learn quite a bit of Lillian through Lamia and Lithos, and her own story could be an opportunity to develop them as well. Also, it's been a while since we got a playable 40-something years old kid, so maybe Lillian can take that spot. Palma is also a member of Dark Ares together with Lillian and Noan. She used to be a member of the Purifying Force, but she was transferred away by Bianca because she was too violent. Palma has a very questionable personality. She is fairly aggressive, and she threatened to kill innocent people in a few occasions, so she could be a great character to explore. Considering that she is also in an important team, I think there are good odds of her becoming playable. Leslie is a member of the Control Court together with Ishmael. She has quite a few appearances in the main story, and even if members of the Control Court are rarely sent on the surface to perform missions, I don't see why she couldn't become a playable character. Her story could also help develop Ishmael as well, showing their work as members of the Control Court. Because of her position, I believe Leslie has a decent chance of becoming playable eventually, unless they want to keep the Control Court as a purely bureaucratic faction. Troyan is a veteran construct that was part of Iris Warbler with Aliza and Isla. However, she secretly works for Leonardo Norman, Teddy's brother, which is often collaborating with Collins, a member of Kurono that's attempting to regain some of his lost influence. Troyan has a very dejected personality, and considering her position as a double agent, she's definitely a character that could be explored. Also, I was expecting her to become playable a long time ago, so I still believe. Vanessa is a human commandant, but we know that she has tantalum affinity since she turned into a construct in the previous timeline, during the 30 years after her failure within the Hetero Tower. It's very unlikely that she will turn into a construct in the new timeline anytime soon, but there is a possibility that she will do so again in the future. Eva is a member of Scarab together with Yata and Discord. Considering that their teammates just became playable, Shiva is definitely another strong candidate, completing another Babylonia squad. We don't really know anything about their backstory, so it could be an opportunity to expand on that, while also getting extra information about the rest of Scarab. Mika is a member of the Cosmos Technicians Union, a Babylonian department that is somewhat similar to the Engineering Force. It's the department that made the Commandant's power armor, and Mika has worked with Karenina, Teddy, and Asimov in a few occasions. She has been introduced only recently, and we don't really know much about her, but as a Babylonia construct, it will be fairly easy to expand her story and connect it to the other characters that we already know. We have seen Emma only during the 30 years of timeskip, but she should be an active member of the Support Force even in our current timeline, so we might see her again. Also, being a Copperfield, it could be a great opportunity to expand the story of that family, especially considering the recent connection to the Leibowitz company that made the matrices, which are related to both Jetavi and Tatiana's stories. In an alternate timeline in which Revenge survived, we ended up in a team with her instead of joining Grey Raven, which could also be an interesting aspect to explore if we end up getting her own story. Therefore, even if she didn't have much screen time so far, Emma could be a great character to explore lore-wise, so she's a strong contender for a playable character. Sylph is a recently introduced member of the Purifying Force, and she was deployed together with Bianca at the Copperfield Aquarium in the new timeline. We don't really know much about her, but since we don't have other playable members of the Purifying Force besides Bianca, she could be an opportunity to explore that faction from someone else's perspective. Long is a member of the Science Council originally from Cologne. We don't know much about him, except for the fact that he provided information about Aerospace City when it had been taken over by Veronica, and about his potential involvement in developing the pirate frame. Considering that he's not a combat construct, there are probably many others that will have priority over him, but I guess it's still a possibility. Bollard was the founder and former captain of the Purifying Force. He was technically killed by Watanabe during Aeon Reforge, and assuming this is still the case in the new timeline, it would be very unlikely for Bollard to become playable. Also, we already explored most of Bollard's backstory through Noctis and Watanabe, so I feel like there wouldn't be much more to add to the character. However, many construct bosses end up becoming playable eventually, so there is a slim chance of a playable Bollard even if it wouldn't make too much sense story-wise. Cannon is an unaffiliated construct that number 21 met in a conservation area around the Cleansden. She doesn't have much relevance to the story, and we haven't seen her since, so it's fairly unlikely for her to become playable. Diana is a member of the Forest Guard in the Arctic Route Union together with Rosetta. She's one of the oldest potentially playable characters, and if I had made this video 3 years ago, she would be high on the list. However, we got many more relevant characters in the meantime, and considering that their design is fairly similar to Rosetta, at this point it will be more likely to get a new Rosetta frame than a playable Diana. Enora is a recently introduced character. Her entire backstory is still fairly unknown beside the fact that she came from another branch of the timeline that had developed some time travel technology. However, despite being currently trapped in Selena's time prison, it has been said that it won't last forever, and I expect her to make a reappearance in the future. Considering that she was also featured in a main story chapter and that she already has a model from her boss form, I think she has a lot of potential to become a playable character down the line. Granny Wong is an old woman that we encountered in a conservation area before even graduating from the FOS Military Academy. She's a fairly new character, but with no real relevance to the main story, especially considering that we encountered her a long time ago and we don't even know if she's still alive. Considering her connection with Leia, it's possible that we will see her again eventually, but unless Kuro wants to cater to the grandmothers and joyers, I don't think she will be a playable character. Olivia is another old construct that we have only seen in Lucia's wedding story. Her situation is similar to Granny Wong's, but maybe they could make a Granny squad to investigate the secret Kurono retirement home. Nigel was a former member of the Purifying Force under Ballard. They plotted to take over the Forsaken and attack Babylonia, but they were ultimately defeated by Watanabe. However, Chang'e had been sent by Jamila to retrieve Nigel when he was in critical conditions, so he's supposedly in the hands of Akdilek, and we might see him again. Also, he is cool, so he will be a great playable character. Tatiana is a regular human, initially trapped within a simulation by Schultz, but she managed to break free with our help. During the simulation, she had acquired a construct form, so she is probably compatible with Tantalum copolymer, and it's very likely that we might encounter her in the future, similarly with what happened with Jatavi. Tsushi is a regular human that fights for Kolong under Pulau, and she helped in defending the city against Cradle and Schultz's attack. We don't know about her affinity to the Tantalum copolymer, so there is still a chance of her turning into a construct eventually. Probably unlikely, since I think it's nice to have more unique characters that are just regular humans, but you never know. Lulu is an unaffiliated construct and Gray's friend, the leader of the Scarlet Revelation cult. After the events of the Copperfield Aquarium, many members of the Scarlet Revelation had joined the Forsaken, so there is a possibility that Lulu did as well, and maybe she could eventually get a more important role there. I will say that many other characters should have priority at the moment, but maybe in the future. Monzano used to be a researcher that dealt with the development of Babylonia, before becoming the Kingpin of Las Pradas, where she conducted many questionable experiments after the Punishing Outbreak. She was technically killed by Lilith. But what if she didn't? Okay, lore-wise it wouldn't make much sense, but she has a cool unique design, so maybe Kuro will be able to perform some waifu resurrection ritual to bring her back. Nirvatia is a newly introduced character in the game mode The Godfall Revelation. At the moment, the story is unrelated to the main story, but usually they end up being connected, like it happened with Cradle, Jetavi and Tatiana. Most likely not anytime soon, but Nirvatia could definitely become playable eventually. Chaos is a Hetero-Creature created by Vonnegut, using Attila and the Grey Raven Commandant's consciousness. Considering her origin, a playable version would be slightly weird, since she could be considered our daughter or even our own self. However, she could still develop as a complete separate being, similarly to what happened with Alpha and Lucia, despite originating from the same mind, and that could make her an interesting character to explore. Probably it's not happening anytime soon, but we might get a playable Chaos eventually. Cradle is a very polite and graceful Hetero-Creature that wants to murder humanity with a smile on her face. However, in the new timeline without the Hetero Tower, Cradle lost part of her powers and memories, making her fairly weak and less aggressive in comparison to what she used to be. From now on, her storyline could really go in many different directions, especially since she might be influenced by the personality that Dominic implanted in her even more. This could even push her towards our side, or at least make her resist Agent Zero's influence whenever the tower will return, since she was already showing signs of resistance even before, as if she didn't want to lose her personality. Regardless of what they're planning to do with her, I believe that these changes are increasing the odds of making Cradle a playable character. That's all I have for now. I don't have a very strong opinion about some of the characters, so they could be easily move up or down a tier, which I did multiple times when making this list, so yeah, it's mostly to give a general idea. It's possible that I forgot someone with some relevance, and as the story goes on, we will get more and more NPCs, so most of them will never become playable. The ratio between all characters receiving a new frame and completely new characters is almost 1:1, but it's getting worse over time, since we'll have more older, popular characters that are competing for an update. A lot will depend on how quickly the main story will progress this time around. A slower pace will give us more opportunities to get more NPCs as playable characters, unless Kuro decides to change the pattern, featuring them in main story chapters. Let me know about your predictions in the comments, and don't forget to vote for Voodoo and Nigel in the next surveys. Anyway, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.